Hello everyone and welcome again. My name is Kent Trammell and this is the 5th video in a series of tutorials covering the creation of a realistic portrait in Blender. In part 5 we're going to finalize our skin shader. First we'll generate our backscatter, subdermal, and epidermal texture maps, then plug those into our shader network and finesse that shader. Then we'll generate our bump and specular maps and render a specular pass in cycles. Finally we'll composite the subsurface and spec together to finish our skin shading. So here in Blender we have the file from the last tutorial where we've created our triple layer subsurface shader, and right now there are no textures plugged in, it's just the RGB values that we have decided we like. So let's see, first thing I'm going to do, because I'm going to use these RGB values as a base to generate my other texture maps, I'm going to take a quick snapshot. There's probably a better way to do this, but I'm going to take a quick snapshot of each of these colors to use in Photoshop. So let me quickly grab those. Okay, we've got all three, and now I want to paint, since I'm in Blender, I want to paint a texture real quick that that will be a mask for our backscatter texture. So I'm just going to call it mask. I'm going to leave it 1024 by 1024. I just want to paint it quickly. I'll scale it up in Photoshop. Turn off the alpha. Okay, and then on my head, I'm going to tab into edit mode. Yeah, I'm going to tab into edit mode and add my mask texture that I just created. Now I'm going to jump into texture paint mode. I'm going to turn on the wireframe here. It's this button beside the viewport shading, and it's just a little cube with texture on, like texture checker texture on one side, and that's going to turn on our wireframe so we can see our mesh better and what we're painting. So with project paint off and the regular brush enabled, and I'm going to grab my Wacom pen. And let's see, strength at 1. I'm going to start painting white where I will want the backscatter to show up. So that's just going to be around the ears here, and note that since it's a smaller 1024 texture, it looks like the brush stroke is not matching the size of my brush icon. So I'm going to just paint over the ears and the ocular cavities, and then clean up around those with project paint. But project paint is slower, it's more CPU intensive, so I'm trying to paint the majority of this just with the default paint method. Okay, so got those sectioned off now, and I'm going to change it to black, decrease the strength, and turn on project paint, turn off normal. Yeah, so let's clean this up. And this is going to be somewhat helpful in our final still image, because again that's the goal that we're shooting for. But really you would want to do this kind of thing for an animation. If your character was going to be animated, you would want to see the subsurface show up in the backscatter to show up in the places you want from all angles. But I'm going to do it anyway for this tutorial, just to take it as far as I can, and hopefully that will help you if you ever choose to use this in animations. So just clean up around these eye cavities. Yeah, it's really going to be hard to see this in the ocular cavity. So I guess you could do without it. It's just, I guess, a habit. I usually keep it in there for, I guess, that one angle that might show up where you want to see it, or you want to see the backscatter. But anyway, let's finish up these masked areas real quick. Okay, I think that will suffice. Yeah, I think that'll be fine. Okay, so be sure to save your texture in the UV image editor, save as image, and then I'm going to save it as backscat mask, and just save it as a JPEG. Okay, so with my mask painted now, that sets me up for Photoshop. So now I'm going to jump there. Okay, so here in Photoshop, what we're going to do is generate our texture maps from this diffuse texture we painted in Blender. So that's what we're looking at here. And first thing I'm going to do is open up the color swatch snapshots that I took. So let me grab those really quick. Okay, the first texture we're going to be painting is this backscatter, which is this dark red. So I'm going to eyedrop, grab that color, and create a new layer, and just fill that with the red. I'm going to duplicate this diffuse texture that we painted. I'm going to apply the mask, and now I'm going to desaturate this. 1 second. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to desaturate this now and use it as an overlay. There we go. Yeah. Then I'm going to just strengthen the darks and the lights. Yeah, with levels a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to open the mask that we just painted in Blender. So let me grab that. And sorry about that. Okay, here we go, the mask. And remember it's 1024, so I need to increase this to 4096. We'll just do best for enlargement. And now I can hit or select everything, copy it, go back to our head texture, and paste this in there. Okay, so this is going to be a simple multiply, and that's it. That's our backscatter texture. So I'm going to just group these layers and call it backscatter. Cool. Okay, so let's do the same thing or similar process for the other ones. This is going to be the subdermal map. Let's grab that color, create a new layer. I'm gonna fill it with that color, fill that layer with the color that we want. And now again, I'm going to duplicate the diffuse texture and apply the map, or apply the mask. And instead of desaturating this, what I'm going to do is match the hue to that color in the background. So we're gonna, let's see, take it more towards that yellow. Let's see, we're gonna saturate it. Yeah, and also go to our levels. Let's see. Let's darken the whole thing a little bit. Let's see. I'm gonna go back to hue and saturation and There we go. Okay, so that's going to be our subdermal map. And let's see, yeah, that's going to be that. I'm going to group it, call it subdermal. And one more time, let's knock out this epidermal. Select the color, new layer, fill that layer with the proper color, duplicate the diffuse texture, apply the mask, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to mess with our hue and saturation to achieve to match the color in the background. So let's turn it to almost pinkish purple, desaturate it quite a bit, and then a little bit more desaturation. And once again with the levels, let's actually I'm gonna leave it. No, I'm gonna move it. Move the middle. Actually, no, I take it back. I'm going to leave it as it is. So that is going to be no, you know, I'm gonna undo this. I want more color variation in the skin. So I'm going to go back into hue saturation, change it back to the pink. Well, to be honest, I think I'm just going to repeat what I just did. Pretty much. That's going to be it. Sorry about that. I'm going to group it. I'm going to call it the epidermal group now. Okay, so these are my textures, at least that I'm going to start with. I can't guarantee I won't come back and edit them later, but I'm going to save each one out now. We're going to call it head SSS. This is the epidermal. Save it as just a JPEG. For your final renders, I'm gonna maintain this PSD, and you know, feel free to save it as a higher quality TIFF or whatever. I honestly just save as JPEGs, and it hasn't hindered me enough for people to notice it yet. So I always just use JPEGs. But anyway, now back in Blender, we need to plug in the textures we just created. So for each layer of subsurface, we're going to add its texture that we made in Photoshop. Let's create a new texture, and we're going to call it Tex Head Epidermal. And it's going to be an image. Let's open that image. And let's see, under mapping, let's change it from generated to UV. Under image sampling, I'm going to change filter size to 0.1. Filter size to 0.1 and turn minimum filter size on to maintain some of the crispness in the shadow, in the texture. Wow. And the influence, we're going to leave it color 1, value of 1. And cool, that one's created. Now for the subdermal, I'm going to pick our texture we just created and duplicate it, and then rename it to subdermal. And I do this to maintain these image sampling settings that I created. I do have to repick UV mapping coordinates, but that's not too big of a deal. So let's open our subdermal texture, and that one's ready. Now for the backscatter, I'm going to, oops, didn't mean to create a new one. Click the subdermal, duplicate it, rename it backscatter, and let's open that texture. Fantastic. Leave the color at 1, change the mapping to UV, and image sampling is all good. Okay, so they're plugged in now, and I'm going to turn off our specularity because that's going to bump us a little bit. And I'm going to, well, yeah, let's just do a preview render now and see what that has given us. Okay, so I forgot to turn the lights back on, but this is fine for a preview just to see what's going on, and it's looking all right. Actually, the combination of subdermal and epidermal has combined to give us that flesh tone that we recognized from the diffuse texture we painted in part 3. So that's good. It shows that the combination of our different layers are kind of giving us that ballpark color that we're looking for. So I'm going to let's see. I'm going to do another preview with the lights back on, and see what that one gives us. So we can see the backscatter, because remember, no backscatter is showing up in this render. Okay, from this preview render, I feel like there's too much orange popping in through the shadows. So because it's orange specifically, that tells me that it's probably the subdermal layer that's a little too strong. So I'm going to jump into that subdermal layer, and I'm going to change, let's see, I'm going to change the RGB radius to, I'm going to half it, so 3, 2, and 2, and that means it's going to be half as much light scattering through the surface. And then I'm also going to change the color of the subsurface, color to 0.3. Oops, let's do it. The value to 0.3 instead of 0.2. And so we'll have less scatter in the skin, but to keep it from darkening, I'm going to raise that value. So now let's jump back to tri-layer, and let's add a new slot, and let's render that, see what that does. Okay, this one I think is correct. It's at least closer to what I'm looking for, but again, I turned the spec off, and it's just hard to look at subsurface by itself. It's like you can't tell where the surface of the skin is. You only see the different layers. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me to see the extent of the surface, I need to just turn that spec back on. So let me do that real quick, and do another render. Okay, so seeing the extent of the surface with the spec on, I think those are good subsurface values for now, but I think this is going to be a good opportunity to create a bump map that will break up that surface, the spec a little bit, and add a little more detail. So I'm going to jump back into Photoshop and do that real quick. Okay, so now in Photoshop I'm going to quickly create a bump map. So I'm going to duplicate once again this diffuse layer. Going to apply the mask. Then I'm also going to create a blank layer. I'm going to change the color to a 50% gray. And fill that. And now our diffuse layer, I'm going to desaturate it and go to Filter, Other, High Pass. This is like the bump map creator filter. So I'm going to make the radius 4. Play with that, get a value that you like. This is really this is a good value for this 4, and then I'm going to open up, if you remember, our displacement that we baked out, and let me find that. Yeah. So remember this guy, we're going to actually use it now. So I'm going to copy. Let's see, select everything, copy it, paste it over here, and I'm going to grab the mask from this guy. Okay, yeah, cut that out. And Okay, so with this, I'm just gonna do an overlay, and let's put the value, the opacity rather, to something like, I think that would be good, something like 25%. Yeah, and this is going to be our bump. So actually I'm going to make it even less. It's just a bump, so let's make it 15%. Cool. So I'm going to group these before I save it. It's going to be our bump group. Perfect. Save as for toot. Perfect. And let's change it to JPEG. It's going to be head bump. And let it save. Wonderful. So that's done. Okay, let's jump back to Blender. In Blender, let's plug in the map that we just created. So on our epidermal, and we're going to put the bump on the epidermal layer and also the subdermal combined. So let's go to the epidermal, create a, well, I'm just going to duplicate this texture again to maintain the image map, image sampling settings. And we're going to duplicate it, call it text head bump. Let's find that texture. Bump. Great. So let's turn the influence off on color. Let's turn it on for our geometry. Let's just leave it at 1. And let's see what that does for us. Let me actually, real quick, let me check my other scene file to find out for sure what value that needs to be at. Okay, so the value we're going to bump up to 2. We're going to exaggerate that bump a little bit. And go down to, oh, you know what I forgot? On the epidermal bump texture, the mapping needs to be UV. Okay, so subdermal, I'm just going to go plug in that same texture that I just created into the second slot, head bump. Again, make sure that the mapping is set to UV. Turn off color influence and turn on normal influence and bump it up to 2. Cool, so now we should see bump happening in the subsurface as well as the speck. It'll be broken up and not be so smooth. So let's find out. Cool, so this is actually kind of a good moment because as soon as we get that high frequency detail from the bump, the subsurface in the face really starts to come alive. At least I think so. So this is too much bump on this speck. So I can dial that back a bit, but now that we see all these little pores and some speck showing up in these little pores, it really starts to bring back your detail. It also, again, I keep saying that it shows the extent of the surface, and that really helps to judge the subsurface, how deep the light is scattering. So it's just that's a good test. That's pretty cool. I am going to dial that bump back down on the epidermal layer, back to 1. Cool. And okay, so now I'm going to start messing with the nodes a little bit more, and specifically I want to add veins into the backscatter. So first, as a starting point, I'm going to let's see, take my head group, I'm going to rotate it back to 0. My lights are on, and I'm going to do a render like this to show what the backscatter is doing and the fact that there are no veins. We can't see any veins or any detail like that. So let me just set up that render real quick. We're just going to focus on the backscatter for this, and we're going to render that. Okay, so here in the render we can see that we've got a little bit of texture play in this render. So that's nice. But I really want to make these veins strong so that they'll show through the other layers. So the way we'll do that is we're going to edit the backscatter texture in our viewport. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, and then in the UV editor, let's select our backscatter texture. And now go to texture paint mode, and grab my pen, and I'm going to paint some veins. They're just going to be black. Let's see. Let's leave it on project paint. Make our brush real small. Let's see what that's doing. Not quite. I'm gonna turn the strength to be governed by my Wacom's pressure sensitivity, and turn off the normal. Okay, that's gonna paint a good vein. So we're just gonna have a little fun with this and start light pressure, and then get harder, and then finish with light pressure again. We're just gonna, let's see, I didn't like that one. Just gonna create some veins. It's a little bit laggy with the screen capture software, but it'll do fine. Okay, this will work for the example. So if this works, I'm probably going to paint these veins behind the scenes just to save a little bit of time. But I mean, just look at an ear and copy the veins, I guess. Nothing really special or difficult about it. So cool. I'm going to save this texture real quick. Save image. And now when I render this, let's see if we get any veins popping through. Let's change this slot, and now let's render. Alright, fantastic. We've got some veins popping up now. So, now the moment of truth. Let's see if that shows up through all the other layers. Let's turn on tri-layer, switch the slot number, and render that. Okay, well, actually I'm a little surprised that they're showing up that well, because they look like almost black snakes crawling in his ear, so that's not what we want. So I'm going to go back and edit those and make them the right color. But anyway, you can see now that those veins are showing up now in the subsurface. And let's see. So we had it. Well, anyway, I didn't set up the slots correctly. But anyway, so that's cool. We've got them showing up. So what I need to do now is fix that texture. But since I know that it's showing up, and I want to save a little bit of time, I'm going to go back and paint these just a darker maroon, not black, not straight black, but just a darker maroon. So I'm going to save some time and edit that out, and then I'll resume when that's completed. Okay, so I went back and fixed the backscatter texture for the veins, and they're showing up better in the render now. They don't look quite as obnoxious. They're still perhaps a little bit strong, but I think it's going to be fine when at full resolution. It really just gives the hint of veins. You can't. It does. I don't think it draws too much attention to them. But anyway, if we look in the texture here, I painted them actually more of a purple color, And that's just behind the idea that blood is blue in the skin. So I went with a purplish tone. And okay, so I'm actually pretty happy now with the way the skin is working. And I think the flesh tones are good. It feels pretty nice. The depth again feels good. There's veins in the backscatter. So now what I need to do is get the spec working properly. So to make that happen, I'm going to texture paint another mask for my specular. So I'm going to create a new texture in my UV editor. New image 2048 by 2048 and call it mask spec. Turn alpha off, doesn't matter. Okay, then I'm going to tab into edit mode on my head and select the mask spec. Okay, let's make a little more room, jump into texture paint mode, turn on our wireframe and switch to my pen. And I'm just going to highlight some areas that I want to be more intense with specularity. So pick our brush, just default brush, change the color to white, strength to, let's just leave it at something like 0.3 or something like that, and turn project paint off. Yeah. So we want around the eyes, and I'm going to decrease the strength some more. Just going to be very free with this and just start to highlight areas like the cheeks and definitely the nose. These are going to be the shinier portions of our skin. It's going to be a subtle mask. So it's good to be again just free with it, and don't kill yourself over making it perfect, because it's not worth that. So I'm going to highlight the inside of the ears. Yeah. Cool. A little bit around the muzzle. Also the chin. And where the 5 o'clock shadow is not very specular. But definitely the forehead. Yeah, I think this will work out pretty good. Let's see what we got. Just gonna go back in and touch up some areas. Let's do a little bit on the neck. Just a little bit. Okay, I think that's going to be, yeah, I think that's going to be a good mask. That'll be good. Alright, so I'm going to save this out, save as image, and call it spec mask. Turn it to JPEG, and okay, now I'm going to use this in Photoshop. So in Photoshop, I'm going to hide the bump map we created in Backscatter group, duplicate our diffuse again, because we derive everything from this diffuse texture that we painted. Oops. Get that out of the bump layer, bump group, and create an empty layer. We're just going to fill that with black, and we're going to desaturate this. And first step is going to be crushing these levels to get a much more contrasted version of our diffuse. And this is just going to add some contrast to our specular map, basically. And so yeah, that's going to be good. And now we're going to open the mask we just created. Spec mask JPEG. And we have to double the size, so increase it by 200%. And then select everything, copy, and paste this over top, and it's going to be an overlay. Cool. And we're going to just turn that down to not be so intense. Yeah, something like that. I think that'll be good. Cool. So let's just group this. And by the way, that opacity is about 50%. And now I'm going to group it, call it specular. And let's save it out. And call it head spec. Okay. Fantastic. Now I'm going to jump back into Blender. The spec texture that we just created. Let's see, open image, spec, head spec. Cool. I need to address a couple discrepancies first. So tab into edit mode. Let's select our head spec. Now in texture paint mode, the first thing that I want to change is it's really dark around the nostrils, and that's from our diffuse texture where there were darker kind of red veins and coloration under the skin. So I want this to be lighter, much, well, I want it to be lighter like the cheeks are. So let's just go in here and start adding some white to that. I'm actually going to change the mix of my the blend of my brush to add. Let's just try and add some value back there. We don't want it to be super shiny. We're not trying to make it sweaty. I've struggled with that in the past. It's so difficult not to, or to hold back on your spec. It's very tempting to overpower it just to show off your details, and then they always end up looking sweaty. But we are going to resist that. We're going to resist that for this tutorial. So I'm going to just do a little bit more. And also I need to make the eyelid closest to the eyeball. I want to make that pure white. I want that to be as, okay, maybe not pure white. But I want that to be, okay. I want that to be the shiniest part for sure, to give that kind of wet look to the eyelids. And also here in the tear duct, we want that to be pretty reflective as well. You know, it's not a bad idea to turn project paint on for this portion. I'm not sure whether the project paint respects the strength of your brush so much better than normal texture paint mode. but it definitely does. Anyway. Alright, that'll be good. I'm going to turn project paint back off because I like the way it painted on the other side. Yeah. Should be good. Paint in the tear duct. And one more time on the top. I think that should be good. And I want to add a little bit to the lips as well, because the diffuse texture, the lips are a darker tone, and that doesn't translate well to the spec because lips are typically a little shinier. But in this pose, most of his the lip mass is sucked into the mouth. But still, that'll be fine. Just add some touches here and there. But overall, I think this is going to work really well as a spec texture. So be sure to save your changes, save image, and now we're ready to start setting up the shader. I'm going to create a new scene and link objects. So new scene, link objects. And I'm going to use these two scenes sort of like render passes, where I can set, they've got the same objects because I link them, but they're going to have different render settings in each scene. So I'm going to call this spec, then go up and name my original one SSS. Okay. So now when I go to the head group in my spec scene, I'm going to change the render engine to cycles render and select my head, delete the tri-layer from the slot, add a new material, and I'm going to adjust my UI and bring up my node editor. And for this new material, I'm going to call it C for cycles, head spec. And I'm going to add a fake user. And okay, so let's get started with this. I'm going to first turn my diffuse to black, add a mix shader, add another shader, glossy, BSDF. We're going to mix those, and I'm going to leave it at 0.5 for now, but I'm going to change the factor. Okay, so now I need to bring in my texture we just painted. Input texture coordinate, input texture, image texture. I'm going to hook up the UV output to the vector input, and let's open our image. Fantastic. Alright, so the first place I'm going to plug this into is going to be our glossy color. So I'm going to set that up now. First, let's just plug it in, and let's see what that gives us. I'm going to switch this to, let's see, object mode and change it to rendered. Let me make sure. Let me change a couple things in my preview samples. Well, render and preview samples, I'm going to go ahead and change to 200, and max bounce. Max bounce is going to be 2, and min bounce is going to be 1, and everything else the same. I'm going to click on no caustics. Okay, so now I'm going to turn on rendered viewport shading. And okay, that is not what I want. So let's stop that. And yeah, so I've got area lights in here right now from when I duplicated the scene. So what I'm gonna do is create mesh planes to use those as lights. And they're really not, they're gonna be lights and they're gonna be emitting light, but mainly we're concerned about their reflections, using them as reflectors, reflecting cards. So I'm gonna ballpark match the area lights underneath and then remove them from the scene. But let's see, I want to scale it out a little bit, give it a little more room. And then I'm going to create a material, make it emission, make the color white, and I'm not sure about the strength quite yet. So I'm going to duplicate that, whoops, undo duplicate, and I'm going to name this material Emit A. Now duplicate the plane, rotate it around the cursor, which is at the center of the head, and now scale with medium point as the pivot. I'm going to scale it up pretty big. Move it out a little bit, scale it a little more. And we're going to go to its shader and add the plus button to duplicate the shader. Go ahead and call it Emit B. It's going to be a different emit shader. Duplicate that one more time. Again, rotate it around the cursor. Scale it in. Position it near the area light. Okay, and now I'm gonna duplicate the shader and call this one Emit C. And then I'm gonna duplicate it one more time. And I'm actually gonna make the transforms turn it back to 0, except for scale. Wonderful. So this is actually going to be a very low-powered, I'm sorry, pick medium point, low-powered card that will represent the floor, as if this portrait is standing on a floor, of course. So this one is going to also have another emit material, and it's going to be D. Okay, so for our world, I need to add another world, and I'm going to turn the background to black, or just, yeah, that's fine. Turn the background to black, and turn the power to 0. Okay, so let's go back to the camera, and right away, let's see what this is doing. And then we can start changing the power of our lights. Okay, so here we can see that with our texture, our spec texture plugged into the glossy color, everywhere that's black is not reflecting, and everywhere that's a greater value than 0 or black is reflecting. So let's see here. What do I want to do first? I want to reposition these lights and change their values a little bit. Let me also rename them. Let's see. I want to name this one light plane key, light plane rim. Name this one light plane fill. And the last one is going to be light plane floor. Cool. So for the key light, You know, actually, I'm gonna wait to plug up that texture. So just remove that connection. I'm gonna change the value to 0.1. The mix, the factor of the mix shader to 0.1. And now let's get some values set up. Wait a minute. Let's get some values set up for our lights. Okay, so I want the fill light to be, let's go to its material settings. I want this to be a little bit blue. Yeah. And I'm going to rotate it in Z around the cursor. Rotate it around, I want a little more blue affecting the nose. About like that. Cool, now I'm going to pick the rim light. I'm going to bump its power up to, let's do 10. Rotate that to be a little, to focus more on the rim instead of the whole head. I think that's gonna, well, again, I don't know why I'm modifying these lights so much, because they're based on the area lights from the old scene. Speaking of which, I can remove them from this scene. Yeah, okay. And now for the key light. So now I'm gonna bump it up to, let's just bump it up to 2 for now. Okay, I think this will work out for the moment, for the time being. Cool. So let's plug back in our texture into the color, see how that changes quite a bit. Tones it down quite a lot. So let's change the mix factor up to 0.3. Well, let's just go back to 0.5. Why not? We'll change all this as we go. Okay. So another thing, well, something I want to add right away to the color is going to be a Fresnel kind of effect. So I'm going to add an input layer weight and change the blend to 0.2. And then add a mix node, color mix. And we're going to change these colors to color 1 to black, and color 2, let me check my notes, it needs to be 0.5, which is 0.5 by default. Yes. So we're going to take the Fresnel output from layer weight and plug it into the factor for our mix node. And now we're going to add another mix node. And we're going to change the blend type to add. Yes, and we're going to plug in our image texture into color slot 1, and our mix from this other mix node into color 2. And now we're going to plug that in. Okay, so as I make these notes to explain what I'm doing, I'm going to just create a shader, emission shader over here, and then it's going to be like a testing shader. So anytime I want to show what the shader is doing, or what portion of the node graph is doing, then I'm going to just plug this up quickly. So now we can see exactly what's happening. So with this layer weight, this is our Fresnel effect. So where it's lighter in color, lighter in value, it's going to reflect more. Yeah, it's going to have more reflection color. And then when we plug it up to this mix node, we can see it added, all the lighter areas added on top. And you can see this nice rim, and it's going to be shinier here on this rim. So it's also going to, it's more realistic. Usually anything that reflects has a bit of a Fresnel in it. So we're going to keep it pretty subtle, but still it adds a nice touch to it. Okay, so let's plug that into our color. Our not diffuse color, but our glossy color. And now plug back in our old shader, well, our real shader. into the surface for our material output. Okay, so that's plugged up and that's looking, let's zoom in a little bit, see what that's doing for us. Cool, that's fine with me. Alright, so now I'm going to duplicate this image texture while I'm thinking about it and open, or I think I already have it loaded. Yes, so we're going to click head bump JPEG. That's what we're looking for. So drag the UV output again to our vector slot, and then we're going to drag this over to our displacement socket. Color to displacement. And right away we're going to see our bump show up. Now I'm not sure why this is, but with cycles it seems the default, it's the opposite of Blender internal. I could be wrong, but I have to add a converter math -1 or negative value. Make the value essentially invert the image texture. So I'm going to use a math node just because I can also use it to tone down the texture. If I don't want it to be 0.1, then I can change it to oh, I'm sorry, what am I trying to say? Oh, if I don't want the texture full strength, then with the math node I can multiply. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah, I need to change the operation to multiply. So I'm going to actually change it to -0.5, make it half as strong and inverted. Okay, so that's going to work out. Let me go ahead and change this roughness to 0.1 so we can, it's a little shinier, a little sharper reflections. And yeah, okay. So now let's move on to our roughness socket. We're going to use the same image texture, and first thing I'm going to do is invert the texture. So color invert, plug that up, and then let me check my notes. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to add a mix node, color mix, and plug this color into socket 2. And then change this value to be, well, first our operation is going to be multiply. So we know that for color 2, which is our inverted texture, let me go ahead and show you what that looks like inverted, so it'll make sense. Wait a minute, is that inverted? Oh, I'm sorry. There we go, now it's inverted. Okay, so yes, as I was saying, the darker areas are going to be shinier. So here we have darker areas on the brow, in the brow wrinkle creases, also especially in the eyelids, where the eyelids meet the eyeball. That's the shiniest part. So that's the darkest area. And then also around the eye sockets, the nose and the cheeks, and a little bit in the lips. So those are the areas that are going to be a crisper value in the shine. So let's plug that back into where we had it, the multiply. And so with the darker area, we're going to multiply a factor of 1, and then this color, the color in slot 1 is going to be our main value for our roughness. So we're going to say it's going to be 0.3. Let me change that. Right here, 0.3 is going to be no saturation. We want it grayscale. So this is going, the 0.3 is going to be the main value in roughness. And when we multiply the darker from our texture, the inverted texture, over our main value of 0.3, then it's going to be a lower value and therefore shinier. So anyway, sorry, that was a little hard to explain than I thought. So let's plug this back up to our material output and see what that's doing for us. Okay, so we can see here around the eyelids we have a very nice sharp shine, and that's implying a wet eyelid from our eyes that are wet. And then let's see, we've got a nice shimmer on the nose. I think that's going to work nice. And yeah, on the ears we've got it's shinier. Oops, the ears is shinier. So yeah, I think this is going to be pretty nice. Yeah, very cool. So this will work well as a speck layer, and I'm going to let's see, I'm going to render this final image as it is right now and test it on the skin. So I'm going to render it. Okay, so with this render, I forgot to turn on our highest level of multi-res in the modifier. I forgot to turn that up to 5, and so we're lacking detail, and also it's still feeling a bit matte. So I think part of the problem is my floor light. I didn't address its strength, and also I think the lights in general can use a little more help. So let's escape out of that, and let's see, let's hit our floor light right now. It's at 1. Let's turn it to 0.3. You don't want a lot. It's to simulate a floor that's bouncing light up. And let's select our key light. I think I want more from the key. Let's turn it to 5. A little more, 10. Yeah. Even more than that, maybe even 15. Yeah, okay, that's feeling better. Then go to my fill light. Let's bump that up to 15 as well, see if that's a good starting point. That's maybe a little too strong. I'll turn it back down to 10. And does that feel better to me? Let's wait for it to finish cleaning up. You know, and I think the value of 0.3 for the head is just too flat. So I'm going to change this color in this multiply mix node. Oh, well that's why. It's at 0.5. So let's change that to 0.3 and see what that does for us. Okay, that's feeling a little bit better. We want a shinier skin because we always have oil on our skin. We don't want sweaty, but we definitely do want it oily. Slightly oily. So this is going to be, yeah, that's much nicer. Much nicer. Let me make sure I have the right texture loaded. I think this is the one I want. Yeah, that's the one I want. Cool. Okay, so texture's loaded, and now I'm gonna turn the modifier, the multi-res modifier render level up to 5, the maximum, and now I'm gonna render this one. Okay, so this is our render, and I'm going to save the image out. Save as image. Let's just go to create a new directory, img. I'm going to call this spec 01. I'm going to save it as a PNG. Really doesn't matter. This is still just previewing, but I'm just going to save it as a PNG. Save as image. And now I'm going to test what it looks like over the subsurface. So I'm going to switch back to the SSS scene now and change the node editor's mode to what is it, compositing nodes. And I'm going to click use nodes. Let's find, here we go. And what I think I forgot, yeah, I forgot my render and need to re-render the subsurface now. So I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so here is my subsurface render, and note that I did add environment lighting to this test render, and it's very low at 0.1, but it's just to show us what's to lighten the shadows a little bit and show us a little bit of detail in there. So for the final render we will be using environment lighting, so right now I'm going to go ahead and turn it on a little bit. So now that we've got this, I'm going to save the image out and call it SSS01. And turn the alpha on, just in case. Doesn't hurt to have it. SSS01, sorry about that. Say it one more time, okay. And I'm only saving it so that if I lose it at any point in the render layer, I still have that image. Now I'm going to add an input image. Let's open our spec render. Add a mix node, color mix, and take our spec pass and plug it into the second input and change the operation to add, factor at 100%, or at 1 rather. Okay, so right away we can see that it does not look good. He looks very, very sweaty, almost metallic, and that is not what we want. So let's change the value down to, let's go 0.3, and that might be okay. I'm going to bump it up a little bit to illustrate what it's doing. Okay, yeah, I think 0.5 is actually a decent value. He doesn't look too sweaty, maybe a little bit sweaty, but still we can see that the eyelids look a little bit moist around the eyeball, which is what I want. And let's see, the nose has a nice speck on it. We've got all kinds of little speck goodies happening around the creases and emphasizing the pore detail that we have. Forehead looks good. Yeah, so this is pretty nice. I like the result here. And yeah, so this will conclude this tutorial. I hope you learned something from it, and thank you for watching.